Hey, CEH Beach is the subject of this in a way. He's made some comments in my anthropomorphism video that maybe I used the wrong example talking about mosquitoes. And it's him saying that mosquitoes just aren't complex enough to have the either or. And see, this is a distinction I just don't get. I'd like somebody to make that distinction, but they can't make it based on, well, obviously this machine's too simple. We don't know why we have consciousness. I mean, to me, the distinction's pretty clear. You know, there's life, there's living matter, and there's unliving matter, and I accept that distinction. But the living matter is the stuff that seems to have a will. You know, yeah, you could say, oh no, we have that. What's so special about the will? It's not the special to human parts. It's just like emotion. Emotions are so lovely and beautiful, and we write poetry with them. So, how could animals have them as well? Well, that the animals have them as well. Yeah, they're powerful because they're so deep, because we share them for so many millions of years. They're so old. That's why they have that strength. Not because they're special to humans. Now, the way we process our emotions, sure, the fact that we turn them into poetry, sure, things like that. But the fact that we have emotions, no. The fact that we have will, even less so. As far as I can see, there's an element of choice and will in every living system. That's what that distinction means. When you break down human being into their parts, you get more and more living things. So you look down, you get living cells. Okay. Now, when you break the cells down, there's organelles in there, and these organelles cannot live outside of the cell. We can imagine that in the past on this planet, that maybe the human environment was a lot like the inside of that cell, and that inside of that cell was to protect that. And as we evolved, it it retained this environment that was no longer really out there in the real world. But so even the parts of the cell look like they might be living and have individual wills. But it starts to break down. But seriously, it does look like that. It looks like the precursors of the cellular life that we understand. It might have been more like viruses. But then if you break those viruses down, you start to just get chemicals that act, that are very interesting. They're interesting, magnetic springs and, you know, things that behave in automated ways, but it starts to look more mechanistic and less like life. So that's the question to me at that point. When we break down a cell do we start to get dead things? But if we say we break down a complex organism into cells, and the cells themselves are just mechanistic automatons, that's not what it looks like at all to me. These things look like they want to survive, you know, if you poke it and it reacts like it's wanting to survive, that's different than when you poke a rock and it doesn't seem to give a damn. If it survives, there's no extra reaction beyond what, the Newtonian kinds of principle of I did something and I pushed it and it moved the other way. You push a living organism and it goes off in a different direction. And people just want to say, well, a mosquito is so simple that, but I mean, come on, if they're so simple, why are they so difficult to control? I mean, something like an insect shows a free choice. It shows a very limited set of choices. They're not wondering if they should go down to the pub. They're just wondering, between the urges that they actually do have. I imagine for the mosquito, it's much like us. They have genetic urges and thirsts. They have a specialized thirst that drives them to want to, you know, drink the blood. Yes, not for their own thirst quenching purposes, but for feeding their, the eggs or whatever. But still, they probably have some sort of thirst like that, and they have a way to tell when they're exhausted, and they have all of these little urges, and not as many as us, not as many as a mammal, but a handful of these things, and they're juggling these handful and using their will to determine which along the way. And there's an argument to be made that they're automated, but it's just funny to put the burden of proof on me. I mean, I think the natural thing is that we all recognize this distinction between living and non-living, and among the living, we can't assume that we are the only ones that have some quality of life, like will. Okay, so I would think there's a burden on you guys to say, well, we have a living system, looks like a living system, an animal that reacts, or an insect, a being that reacts as though it's living, and then you have to prove why. Oh, it's so simple, and I just don't understand why people think that. We don't know enough about consciousness to prove these kinds of things. Now, in the end, you have to remember there's the solipsistic argument in philosophy that we don't overcome we have to work with. Okay, and the thing is, I don't know that other human beings even have the emotional states that I have. It seems that they do because they behave a certain way that I would behave in a similar situation. So I can imagine relativistically, I can put myself into other people's shoes and say, oh, looks like they have emotions because of this behavior. But you have to remember, it's that behavior that's told me about the emotions. And other living things do have that behavior. They do seem to be autonomous. They seem to have their own will, their own interests, desires, their own drives, and their own way of negotiating the conflict between these drives. So I don't see how you can make any distinction before we get to the point of breaking viral type entities down into their constituent chemicals. Um, Prior to that level, I don't think you can start assuming, the automation. Yeah, you can assume the automation, but you didn't want to call it autopilot. The way a rock reacts to a flood, you didn't want to call that an autopilot. That's not even being piloted at all. And you want to say the autopilot isn't really a pilot either. It's just sort of automatic, like a rock being pushed down the river. It's mechanical. That's an assumption. This is why anthropomorphism bothers me, because it's an egocentric, an anthropocentric, attitude by which people believe that they are special without any particular principled justification. Special in ways they're not special. People are special, but not in these ways.